So every few weeks, I, against my better judgment, get on some of the bike forums just to see what kind of questions are out there, what kind of things, new or old, people are struggling with. And something that kind of kept coming up was this theme of how you should sit on your saddle. And I was really struck by the pervasiveness of the terrible advice that was out there on what you should and shouldn't do and what's the best way to go about it. And the people writing seemed to have such authority about. They really felt like this was exactly the proper way to do this. For instance, I read from someone who touted himself as a coach, and he'd done thousands of bike fits, and he wrote a whole article about how, and I'm quoting here, he wrote, you know, when you're on the bike, you just roll your hips forward, flatten your back, and pretend like you're pinching a pencil between your shoulder blades, which sounds great unless you don't have the whole setup that's in place to support that. And then another one, this is from granted, this is from a forum, but it was a kind of it was like a beginner triathlete type of forum. And this person that had posted often and seemed to speak with a lot of authority. I think a lot of people were listening to this person, unfortunately. And this is a direct quote again. He wrote that most people are best served by rolling their pelvis forward so they're on their perineum instead of the sit bones. No. Absolutely not. Don't ever do that. Pressure on the perineum is never correct. Let's just start there. This is the area of our undercarriage, you could say, where all the nerves and blood vessels that run down there exist. That's where they exist. And unless you want to have urological or sexual dysfunction, you need to really find a way to stay off of this area. So how do we go about sitting? What are the ways? What should we do? Well, you have two main choices. We're going to go over first, which is the more aggressive method. The first more aggressive method is one that is often used by professionals, as you might imagine. But certainly very fit or very well-trained age groupers certainly could attain this position without too much trouble. And this first position I call the braced method, okay? And what this refers to is that the pelvis is resting on the saddle, but it bears a slightly lower percentage of the body weight, such that the pelvic posture and the movement of the pelvis over the saddle is more dynamic. So the pelvis probably bears a little bit less weight than it would, say, in a road position. This does require a strong upper body, strong trunk, and it doesn't hurt to have good flexibility either. So those three requirements can sometimes rule out certain individuals, and in some cases, a lot of us. So the pelvis in this situation, it will tip forward more, but when it's done correctly, the perineum won't be impacted, and so we won't get this numbness or this discomfort or these issues. In a lot of situations with this braced method, one of the more popular, and sometimes I think one of the easier ways to attain this, is through the use of some of the split nose saddles like the ISMs or the Cobb saddles. These function to allow the sit bones to sit at the very front of the saddle, and then the pelvis is allowed to tip forward and the perineum is essentially floating off in space. And so the perineum, because of this, it's kind of off the front of the saddle. It's really not making much contact with the saddle at all. This does allow, again, the pelvis does tip forward, so it flattens the back and creates a more aerodynamic position. We're bearing weight on a smaller surface area. We're tipped forward anteriorly more onto a narrower portion of the pelvis. We're probably going to bear a little bit less weight on the pelvis as a whole, so the upper body is probably going to take a little bit more in this position. For women, this is especially important for a couple of reasons. The first is that from an anatomy standpoint, the women's pelvis obviously is shaped a little bit differently, and everyone always talks about how it's set wider, and that's sometimes the case, yes. But the more important thing is that the pubic arch, basically the height of the front of the pelvis, is not quite as tall as it is with the men. And also the female's soft tissues extend further to the back, further posteriorly. And so really their pelvis is going to be impacted, or some of the soft tissues of the pelvis are going to be impacted sooner with the same amount of anterior pelvic tilt. So on average, if you took a male and female pelvis and tipped them forward the same degree, there's going to be more soft tissue involvement on the female side. And this is one of the reasons why there's a really high incidence of gynecological problems and surgeries in the women's pro peloton in professional cycling. So it's especially important for women on the bike seeking a more aggressive position to really make use of the technology and the equipment available to allow the pelvis, if they are going for that aggressive position, to tip forward without impacting these tissues. So again, if you're stronger, you're very stable on the bike and pretty flexible, this can be a really sustainable position for a long time. The average Joe might not have the stability and the flexibility to maintain this, however, because what we're doing is we're requiring the pelvis and the lower body to work from a more dynamic platform, essentially. So it's kind of the difference between, I don't lift weights as much as an Olympic powerlifter does, clearly, obviously. And so, an Olympic powerlifter doing an overhead clean is going to be able to get the bar overhead with no support and be very stable. However, if I were to try and lift, a significant amount of weight overhead, it would help if I had some sort of back support potentially, or I was sitting down to provide some stability. So they have the dynamic stability to maintain posture, and I don't. And kind of the same thing goes with generating power in an aggressive dynamic position on a tri-bike. So let's talk about the less aggressive position here. And I call this the perched method. So we had the braced method, and now we have the perched method. This is going to be not exactly like, but it's going to be more similar to a road bike position as far as the pelvis goes. So if we had a continuum where we had our braced method, our very aggressive time trial position where the pelvis is resting in a very dynamic way on the saddle, and we had our road position where it's resting in a bit more of a static posture, this perched method is going to be somewhere in the middle. It's going to kind of depend on how far we take things. But this perched method, this slightly more static method, is going to require usually a little higher handlebar position. This is because that this perched method is going to require that the pelvis sit upright just a little bit more, a few degrees more. If that pelvis sits more upright, then the spine sits more upright, then the shoulders are more higher up in the air slightly, and therefore the bar has to be compensated to accommodate this height. So the less fit, the less stable, the less flexible you are, the more you're going to have to gravitate towards this perched posture. And especially if you plan to be on the bike for a long time, like for instance for a 70.3 or a full iron distance race. This is it's good to think about the pelvis in this situation as it's really resting on the saddle. Again, in a more static fashion. Because we're more static on the saddle, there's going to be more weight borne through the seat. And this is why it probably benefits, again, from having the pelvis be tipped up posteriorly a little bit more, because then we're bearing weight through a wider portion of the pelvis with larger bone structure as well. Because as we move anteriorly, the bones get less pronounced and thinner. And so by tipping up a little bit, we are creating a wider surface, a footprint, you might say, but then also through a slightly larger bone structure, which is going to help distribute the pressure just a little bit better. It can be a real problem when people try and get too much weight anteriorly. And again, we're on that narrower portion and smaller bone portion of the pelvis. And then you're also not really taking the extra weight from the pelvis and moving it to the feet and the hands. And that puts an extremely high level of pressure on the pelvis in a very small surface area, and that really is a recipe for problems. So it's important to know this is not a completely lazy, static position. The upper body and the trunk still needs to be in the game in order for this to work. And so if we do get lazy or tired through a course of a ride, and the trunk sort of starts to give in just a little bit, then this position is going to fail, just like the braced method would. So we still have to, this still is an active position. This is not something where we're just going to hang out in this position in a very passive way. So the more perched, the slightly more static method, it's certainly possible. I've done it hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, where we set people up on what we would consider like a traditionally shaped saddle, just a triathlon saddle or a time trial saddle, but nothing out of the ordinary as far as shape. However, if a rider that is still using this slightly less aggressive method, this perched method, wants to be a little bit more aggressive, sometimes we can kind of blend two things, and we can use something like a split nose saddle, like an ISM, and it can allow that person to then shift their pelvis to the front of that saddle, get the pelvis tipped forward anteriorly, and now maybe we're just slightly closer to that braced method, a little bit more aggressive, not all the way probably to what a professional is going to be able to maintain, but it might allow sort of the average age grouper to get slightly more aggressive on their bike. This position where we're kind of doing this hybrid, again, it'll require a little bit more in the stability, trunk stability area, and it might require a little bit more of the upper body too. So this has to be weighed whether it's feasible for the rider depending on the distance that they're trying to race. And certainly this is something that's going to also have a longer break-in period. As you'll notice, nowhere in this discussion are we talking about just blindly tipping the pelvis forward so that we can flatten our back. That is absolutely a recipe for disaster unless you've really prepared everything else to accommodate for this. Everyone's amount of anterior pelvic tilt that they can maintain or should maintain is going to be different based on, again, flexibility and strength and all these other things. And so we really need to tailor the position to the rider. And there is no simple answer. There's no one size fits all or you should do this. So if you have people telling you that, whether it's, a coach or someone on a forum, something like that, you need to kind of ignore some of that. You need to figure out what's going to work for you. So that's it for this one. Let me know about your positions on your time trial or triathlon bike. What kind of things have you struggled with? Have you experienced any of these issues? Have you gone through different saddles, that sort of thing? If you think this video would help somebody else, I'd really appreciate it if you would share it, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or something like that. That really helps out. Check out some other videos, and again, if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks, guys.